Hi, this is Keith Walker. I'm recording a video response to Group Three's case study, and I'm going to discuss the peer review I created for their document. All right, so as I'm looking at their document, I'm also focusing on the rubric that I have to use to score the document. And the rubric is divided into some simple segments. I have to evaluate the thesis, the logical coherence and development of their case study, the evidence they produced, the mechanics, syntax, punctuation, spelling, APA guidelines, and also I have to identify one strength example within their response and one area of improvement. All right, so as I'm looking through their case study, the first thing that strikes me as I'm looking for the thesis is the organization of the paper. In the introduction paragraph, they gave it a title, Rising Above. And the things I liked about it, that introduction, the whole paragraph, they did a good job introducing the school. And then later in it, they had a simile in there that really caught my attention because I'm an English major. So I love figurative language. And in their paper, they compared Mr. Jones to mold, which they said was caused by stagnant water and indicated how it could fester and have a negative impact on the whole climate of the school. I really like that simile. It has nothing to do with the thesis. It just struck me as an English teacher. I really liked it. And when I finally get to the thesis statement that they have in their paper, I believe this is the thesis statement. This is what I would recognize as a thesis statement. Closing their introduction paragraph, they said, our school has many improvements that can be made, such as test scores and closing the achievement gap. But we must first focus on helping Mr. Jones change his mindset and attitude about students from different backgrounds. All right, so that's the thesis statement. And in my paper, I indicated that it's appropriate because it addressed two campus goals as well as the primary area of concern for Mr. Jones. So for this section, the thesis, and I'm hoping this is thesis statement, not like collegiate level thesis, but if I'm referring just to the thesis statement, according to the rubric, I indicated that this thesis statement scored all the marks. It has everything that's necessary for a thesis statement. It fulfills all the requirements to get a rating 5 for the thesis statement. All right, so I move on to part 2. And in my paper that I wrote, I actually combined part 2 and part 3. Part 2 is the logical coherence and development of their paper, and part 3 is the evidence. And the reason why I combined them when I wrote my peer review is because they are intertwined throughout. So right off the bat, I really love the organization of their paper. I noticed that the introduction, as I mentioned, was titled Rising Above. And then we get to the next section, which is titled Areas of Concern. And Group 3 divided this into 2 parts. They addressed the campus challenges, and they also addressed Mr. Jones's challenges. So in the first section with the campus challenges, they did a good job of bringing in the statistics from the case study. They indicated that, according to a teacher survey, 95% of the teachers didn't believe that multicultural training was necessary at the school, which clearly it was. And I also like how they tied this into outside sources. They have a quote in their document that says, this specific statement raises concerns specifically given the disparity in student achievement scores released from TEA. So by mentioning the TEA, they recognize the disparity between the test scores, and it's clear that the mind state of the teachers probably has a good deal to do with the test scores for the minority students. So I really like that. They also brought in more outside sources with when they were mentioned in the survey. They indicated that this group does well at, what I wrote in my paper was this group does well at trying to find a direct link between the underperforming minority students and the mindset of the teachers on the campus. And they had this quote that made me refer to that. After analyzing the teacher cultural competence survey results and the data from TEA, it's apparent that the staff as a whole at TMMSHEJ needs training in multicultural education. And as far as that, the thing that stood out to me that I found impressive was they did involve the whole campus. So we had the data from the teacher survey, but we were told in the assignment to focus on Mr. Jones. But this group, they took it a step further. They realized that the problems that Mr. Jones has is actually a campus-wide problem, and they chose to address it. And they went as far as saying that the whole campus is going to read diversity and equity in the classroom, and they're all going to discuss it. They made this a campus requirement. I also gave them kudos by mentioning this book because this is the textbook for my course. Another thing that I found that I liked in there was just the evidence. They have another quote in there that says, oh, they were bringing in evidence from, the actual case that we're focusing on. So in addition to the letter that Mr. Jones wrote, which was a big part of his whole development plan, they mentioned that Mr. Jones is constantly making racist comments towards his students. That was a quote from them. And they also brought in a quote where he told a Hispanic student, work harder or you will end up like your ancestors in the garden. So they brought in both of these quotes as more evidence for their professional development plan that they were about to introduce. Another piece of evidence, they rightly so indicated that Mr. Jones' actions reveal an ethnocentric and egocentric attitude. So that came directly from our textbook. And after mentioning that, they gave a quote from our textbook to back it up. So the evidence was seen throughout. Another piece of evidence that they used, they brought in quotes like this one. When teachers respect and are committed to students, educators want to listen and know about them. And they have another quote here. Teaching the whole student means to know the whole person, including his or her cultural background and identity. All right, so both of these statements are definitely correct, and they're definitely related to what's going on with Mr. Jones. So by bringing in these sources, like I said, they just give more credence to the development plan they're going to. Later, they actually get into the improvement plan. And this is in the improvement plan section of their paper. So they came up with 3 goals for him. The first goal is for him to participate in professional development trainings, which was kind of a gimme. The second goal was for him to do observations with another teacher and have that teacher observe him, and they could go back and forth with that. And the third goal is to, and this is the goal I didn't like, but I'm going to discuss that later. They said Mr. Jones should have 3 or less student complaints and 20% or less racially insensitive words or phrases during conversations with the principal. So after they gave the brief overview of the goals, they went into detail for each goals, and they continued to bring in evidence to show that the research backed up their goals. They have evidence from, I don't know if I can pronounce this name, Nikoshioka and Perlaza. So they brought in sources that are outside of the textbooks that we used in our course, which once again is a good idea. So based on the fact that they brought in so much evidence, which is a part of our rubric, I indicated that they should get full credit for the evidence portion of the rubric. They satisfied the requirements, in my opinion, to receive all the credit for the evidence. And later, when they started getting into the goals in more detail, that's when I could see that they're still using evidence in the goal language. And now they're really focusing on all the metrics of the SMART goal template, which was another requirement for our group. So they did this with goal 1, goal 2, and also goal 3. I personally think goal 2 was the best goal, which I mentioned in my response, because I think that when it comes to professional development trainings, they could be modules, they could be online. Maybe the teacher pays attention, maybe they don't. But when you pair a teacher with a veteran teacher and the principal is also involved in observing Mr. Jones's classes, they can see his teaching practices and try to help them learn from them. Their quote was, the exact wording of the goal was, in addition to this, the veteran teacher or principal will also be observing Mr. Jones's classroom to see if he's making an effort to change his teaching practices and provide an inclusive learning environment, which I think is the strongest goal overall. Goal 3, once again, I'll get to that later because I actually mentioned goal 3 as a area of improvement. So as I was looking through the whole thing, I noticed that after that, they brought in figure 1. So figure 1 is basically like a little diagram, a chart. It's like a chart where they have the goals all outlined in a more minimal way where you can kind of see it at a glance. You can see the goal. And as I'm looking at the chart right now, I'll tell you the categories on it. The goal, it has the activity, the specific goal, the explanation of it, the date and time of it, and additional details where they have links inside of this chart. And this is called a summary of improvement plan for Mr. Jones. So adding this chart in here, in my response, I compared it to the the chart that we get for our assignments and courses like this, where you get the syllabus and you get the modules on the online course, but that assignment page where you can see all of your things laid out, the due date, the readings, all of that very clear and concise. That's like the go-to I use when I'm in a course like this. So I think the chart that they brought in was an excellent idea, and they created it very well. So based on all of that, I gave them, once again, all the points possible for logical coherence and development. I just think that as a whole, this case study is organized extremely well. It's very logical, it's very coherent, and it has a very nice flow to it. Part 4, I found a few grammatical issues, but I gave them all the credit for this part as well, because the few grammatical issues I found, they weren't a distraction. And in my paper I wrote, while there are a few grammatical errors, they are not distracting, and the organization and style of writing vastly overcomes these errors. So they got all the points for that. All right, so I think, and that was the APA as well. All the APA citations are on point. All right, so lastly, I have to identify a strength, and I also have to identify an area of improvement. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, actually, I don't know if I mentioned this, but it's in my paper. I'm an English major. So I've taught high school English. I've taught some high school dual enrollment collegiate courses as well. So teaching writing is my forte. It's the thing I love to do the most outside of moving on to leadership. But as I teach writing, organization is always a key element that students have to get down before they get into the nitty-gritty of what they're going to write about. They have to know how to organize a paper. And that's why I would say this is the greatest strength of this paper. And that falls into the logical coherence and development portion of the rubric. The direct quote from my peer response says, as I look through their document, I'm impressed with how they divided the sections of the case study with titles that will inform the reader what to expect with each section. I thought that was a major plus. Also, they titled the whole document Rising Above, which I thought was very appropriate because the principal that they're stepping into the shoes of, he wants to rise above the negative mind state of Mr. Jones and the rest of the teachers on the campus. The other sections, Areas of Concern, was a good title for that. Then they get into the improvement plan. And as I mentioned, the chart that they created, I just thought that was a very nice looking chart. It was very well organized and it was easy to follow just at a glance. So overall, I think the organization portion of their paper is their strongest element. I would say their second strongest element in this paper is the evidence. They brought in a lot of evidence. Everything that they had to say, everything that they wanted Mr. Jones to do was backed up by evidence, either from our textbook or outside sources. So if I wasn't going to go with the organization, I would definitely say the evidence presented to justify the professional development plan. The evidence would be the strongest piece of this work. All right, so lastly, we're going to get into the area of improvement. And as I mentioned, goal 3 was the goal that I felt like needed a little bit of tweaking. All right, so as a refresher, I'm going to read exactly the wording of their goal. Mr. Jones should have 3 or less student complaints. Ideally, Mr. Jones will use 20% or less racially insensitive words, phrases, or sentences during conversations with me. This will be a drastic improvement from the 86% of thoughtless sentences that were included in Mr. Jones's letter. So I'm thinking that the group's rationale for this is that if he received a certain number of complaints last year, which he did, they said he received 7 racial complaints from students or parents in the first semester and 9 racial complaints in the second semester. So in total, that's 16 complaints a year. So having this number go all the way down to 3, I'm guessing that this group felt like that would show improvement. But I don't agree with that assertion. And the reason I don't agree with it is because I feel like certain goals, when you're a principal, there are certain goals that shouldn't be taken down. They should be immediately eliminated. And the examples that I mentioned in my response was if a principal had a student that was skipping school, they had a truancy issue. I wouldn't, as a principal, if I'm facing this student, say, well, you skipped classes 10 times last month or last semester. So next month, let's get that number down to just 2. Just skip class 2 times. In my opinion, that's kind of a weird thing to tell a kid. Also, what if it was a student that was fighting? Would I tell them, Okay, so you had about 9 fights last year. You beat up 9 kids. Next year, just beat up 2 kids. Let's just get it down to 2 or 3 kids. I'm gonna let you beat up 3 kids. Once again, that doesn't sound right to me. And when I'm looking at Mr. Jones, I feel like saying something racially insensitive to a student, that's equally wrong. And that should be 0 immediately. So I wouldn't have given him a goal that brought that number down. I would have told him immediately, that's done. It cannot happen at this year at all. I would tell them that during a meeting, and you're going to get written up the first time it happens and each additional time. The other part of it says Mr. Jones will use 20% or less. I'm sorry, it's kind of funny to me. Mr. Jones will use 20% or less racially insensitive words, phrases, or sentences during conversations with me. Okay, so obviously I'm a black man. You're looking at me. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, what does that look like? I'm sitting across from a teacher who is white, and he has said some racially insensitive things, words and phrases in a letter. But as he's facing me, I'm going to try to limit the number of racially insensitive things he's saying directly to me. Once again, that's not happening. That's going to be 0 starting on day 1. I'm not going to have an acceptable number of things you could say to me that are racially insensitive. I'm the principal, and yeah, that's not going to fly. So I had to end the paper with the area of improvement, but I didn't want to end in that note, and I mentioned it in my peer response. I didn't want to end it on that note because I think they did an excellent job on the paper overall. So I didn't want to end on a negative note or with a negative tone. And also, the area of improvement is not a scored portion of the rubric. So even though I have an area of improvement, it doesn't affect the overall score. So based on the other portions of the rubric, I gave them all the marks for all of those portions. So these areas of improvement would not affect their grade. I would still give them full credit overall for the assignment. All right, so that is my video, my peer review response video for the peer review that I did for Group 3's case study. I don't know how to end this, so I'll just say, all right, thank you, goodbye.